All right, friends, what's up? Trump has put Putin on the clock, meaning now it's not a 50-day ultimatum, but just 10. And by the way, the clock is already ticking. By the way, the Kremlin has already responded to this. Peskov, for example, sounded almost rattled, saying that the Kremlin has taken note of Trump's new ultimatum. Medvedev also woke up over there. And of course, he started threatening the West with war. But what about Putin? Well, Putin ended up in St. Petersburg. He wasn't just attending a memorial for the Russian Navy, but also sort of made a public appearance. Though whether those were actually ordinary people or just actors dressed up as such is, to put it mildly, a very interesting question. Friends, there are a lot of topics to cover. Now, let's watch the segment, and then we'll have an exclusive conversation with Rostislav Murzagulov. Let's go. The countdown has begun. US President Trump has issued a new ultimatum to the Kremlin.
I will set a new deadline, about 10 or 12 days. There's no reason to wait. It was 50 days. I wanted to be generous, but we just don't see any progress.
The American leader also emphasized that he's no longer interested in talking to the Kremlin dictator Putin.
I'm not really interested in talking anymore. We used to have such pleasant conversations, such respectful and good conversations. And then, the next night, people die from rockets flying into cities.
Trump sets deadlines unilaterally and on his own. And by doing this, he shows that he supposedly controls the situation, and he is steering Putin toward a certain period of decisions, certain decision-making format. However, this actually clearly shows that Donald Trump profoundly understands that Vladimir Putin is absolutely not going to pursue a genuine, real, peaceful settlement, but rather a deceptive, fake, imitative one, as he is demonstrating right now.
If Russia refuses to sign a peace agreement with Ukraine, the United States may impose secondary sanctions against Moscow.
It is obvious that the United States toolkit is threefold. First, it is the provision of increased military aid to Ukraine. Second, it is the imposition of secondary sanctions against countries, companies, and economic entities that allow Russia to circumvent sanctions. These are, first and foremost, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, China, India, and Kazakhstan. And this is the possible embargo on Russian goods.
Such news simply drove Dmitry Medvedev into a frenzy, and he began threatening the United States with war.
Trump is playing a game of ultimatums with Russia. 50 days or 10. He should remember two things. Russia is not Israel and not even Iran. Every new ultimatum is a threat and a step toward war, not between Russia and Ukraine, but with his own country. Don't repeat Sleepy Joe's path.
Medvedev is intentionally released into the broader public sphere solely for the explicit purpose of setting some kind of media agenda. But the real reaction there are Russia's real response. The official circles of the Russian Federation is shaped based on Putin's line of behavior. This has absolutely nothing to do with what Medvedev says or thinks. It's just a way to play around with media noise.
Loud statements were also made by horsehead Lavrov. He stated that Russia has a complete lack of allies. Well, who would have doubted the claims his country is fighting alone against the entire West?
Sergei Lavrov's primary task, working closely together with Maria Zakharova, is to meticulously shape a particular kind of informational picture, and through his often unprofessional actions and public statements, consistently accompany and support the general Kremlin's official line.
But while Putin's servants are playing to the audience, Azerbaijan has started supplying gas to Ukraine. We're talking about small volumes, but as noted in the oil and gas sector, this is a strategic step toward expanding cooperation.
It was difficult for Ukrainian diplomacy to break through the barrier in Ukrainian-Azerbaijan relations that had formed during Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And it's clear that Azerbaijan's foreign policy line is focused on maintaining a balance. And of course, for a long time, they did not want to have any kind of conflict or misunderstandings with the Russian Federation. However, the grave situation involving the tragic deaths of passengers on the Azov airline coupled with the escalating tension concerning the alleged repression of Azerbaijani citizens residing within Russia, has undeniably and significantly altered the Azerbaijani leadership's fundamental perception of Russia's true and underlying attitude toward Baku.
And finally, a shocking piece of news. The Kremlin dictator appeared before the people on Sunday in St. Petersburg. Putin stopped his limousine to meet Russians on the street. This happened for the first time since October of last year.
We all clearly understand that this is a very meticulously and elaborately staged theatrical event involving a truly immense number of security service agents who provide both comprehensive protection and diligently ensure the desired behavior of the assembled people, as well as strategically planted individuals who convincingly pretend to be ordinary, enthusiastic Russians, supposedly genuinely overjoyed and absolutely ecstatic at meeting the revered Tsar, father in quotes. So this is a typical PR strategy.
Well, then we can probably expect Putin's next appearance among the people in about a year.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Rostislav Miltsagulov, political strategist and publicist, joins our broadcast. Rostislav, welcome!
Good afternoon. I was just watching your segment and remembered the year 2010 meeting of the National Council of the Russian Federation. There was such a body back then. I was the vice governor of Bashkiria, and I was responsible for organizing the event because it was all taking place in Ufa. And I can tell you in great detail how, in reality, several security cordons are set up to protect Putin from random citizens. I just saw it now, how these costume people first walk in one row, then in another, each one memorizing their lines, each one knowing exactly what to do. And honestly, it was a disgusting farce, even back in 2010. And now, just looking at the footage, nothing has changed.
I want to tell you, Rostislav, there's another interesting point about this. Well, because of my job, I had to watch this circus. There was one man who approached Putin and said, now I can die, I've seen you, I can die. And purely by coincidence, his name is Pavel Morozov. That's just how it turned out. Yes, just by chance. So tell me, please, in 2025, who is this even for Rostislav?
Well, people eat it up as...
They really do eat it up, huh?
As Bogdan Titomir, who's originally from Ukraine, once said. They're still eating it up. Unfortunately, people in Russia are absolutely not resistant to media influence. In terms of their media resistance, they are still stuck somewhere around the level of Ukrainians in the early 2000s. Because in Ukraine, there was always this kind of ferment. There were always a lot of political forces in Ukraine, and they were far from perfect. There were plenty of different scoundrels who held power there. But the main thing was pluralism. There was multipolarity, right? And so when people chose among the opposition, they could compare the different viewpoints of various politicians. They could watch different media outlets, which of course were also subject to influence, some from one side, some from the other. And that's why in the end, this resilience developed in Ukraine. And that's why ultimately a civil society formed in Ukraine, the very one that today enables the country to successfully defend itself against, well, these barbarians from the east. In Russia, all of this was paved over. It must be said that Putin carried out this special operation carefully and efficiently. I rarely praise Putin, but when it comes to stifling freedoms, he is a true master. He observed the work of the Stasi. He himself was a career officer in the Stasi. And from the Germans, with their meticulousness and systematic approach, he learned how to suffocate freedom carefully but forcefully, right up to asphyxiation, and in such a way that the person would die simply going limp and without much noise or fuss. And in all of this, by the way, it was very important for Agent Medvedev, who pretended to be a liberal. And an old fool though I was still young back then, fell for it and went along with it, thinking that we really were experiencing a thaw, that there really was some kind of showdown going on between us, the good systemic liberals of Russia, and them, the bad Putinist generals, the KGB guys, as we used to call them. In reality, of course, looking at this forest monster now, it's obvious and clear that it was simply a cover operation, an infiltration operation. This little bastard was planted among us. He gathered all of us around himself, and then all at once we were rounded up into one pile and sent off in different directions, some to prison, some were killed, and some into exile. That's how lucky I got, for example.
By the way, yes, Rostislav, nothing is going according to plan today, but that just makes it even more interesting. So all these stories about Medvedev that supposedly before the power swap, before it happened there, were people who wanted Medvedev to stay, and that Medvedev actually had a real chance to remain president of the Russian Federation, all of that is complete nonsense.
He would have simply carried out any order from Putin because there was a certain situation when one of those people from that same, let's say, team, right? By the way, you can easily trace all of this on my Facebook. For those who might doubt it, there are even photos of me from 2010 at that National Council where I'm walking with Putin. There are photos of me walking with Medvedev, and there are some from a bit earlier and a bit later as well. So indeed, there was a transgression. That's right. The thing is, there was a situation when one of us asked Medvedev a direct question just shortly before that infamous fishing trip and that notorious Congress everything was getting really tense at that point. And we were all very worried that if Putin came back, all the security officials would return with him, along with the all-encompassing influence of Igor Sechin, who at that time, the siren just went off for me. I guess you have it too. After all, we're both in Kyiv.
Same here.
Yes. Hello, former friends. They must have sensed I was talking about them. So one of my close friends who had a mandate to see Medvedev at any time went to him. Well, actually, he flew to see him. He took me along with him. By the way, I was sitting in the little waiting room, waiting for them to finish their conversation. And when he came out, he said, everything's great. Dima said that nothing was going to change back, that the paradigm would remain the same. We keep developing, working, building businesses. No one needs to leave anywhere. But a couple of weeks later, I saw that infamous scene with the reverse power swap, and everything became clear to me. That's when I realized that we had all been played, that we had simply been systematized. Yeah, basically, to put it bluntly, they made a list of these unreliable people, the non-imperials, those who aren't Soviet citizens, so to speak. And then, accordingly, to smear everyone, a bit later, they did the same thing when they provoked people to take to the streets in Russia a year before the war. You understand now, it's clear that all of that wasn't done for nothing either, when everyone who could lead others also came out. And accordingly, they were all registered in the same way. And then accordingly, some were thrown in prison, others were forced into immigration. And by the way, they also came to me and said, buddy, you should probably leave too. So this kind of work to suffocate freedom was being carried out there quite carefully for a long time. And now, unfortunately, to make this long story short, and coming back to your question, that's how freedom was strangled there. And I really hope that here in Ukraine, this will never happen.
We really hope so. And friends, by the way, since we started talking about how the Russian people just swallow it all and so on, if you want to get information that can be called reliabilized, personal, but nevertheless objective, please go to Rostislav Marzagulov's YouTube channel, subscribe and give it a like. And don't forget about us either. Rostislav, now let's move on to the agenda, so to speak. This whole story about the ultimatum, which is now not 50 days, but 10 days. There are absolutely all kinds of opinions about it. And in general, did this positive development, let's say, surprise the Kremlin folks over there behind their walls? Like Medvedev, for example.
Yes.
Yes. Were they surprised?
They're confused over there. They're in despair. Actually, that's been the case there for quite a while. After all, it's not for nothing that Putin doesn't react at all to everything that's happening, because he simply doesn't know how. Because once again, he finds himself in a zugzwang situation brilliantly, in quotes, manages to put himself there every time. And with every new move, he brings himself closer to an even more difficult situation on this big chessboard. And now I think he's frantically searching for some new opportunities for yet another, let's say, strategic move to a more advantageous position, for another so-called gesture of goodwill, perhaps even a significant one, because I don't believe that in response to these tough statements from Trump, Putin will go head-to-head or start doing something drastic, because he understands perfectly well that the weight classes are very unequal. He was really hoping that Trump, who loves money and big projects in this world, can only be done with dictators, because with normal Westerners, you can only do regular business. And with regular business, the profit margin is, 5%, maybe 10. But when you work with dictators and a dictator just hands over some huge gas pipeline to you, like, say, Nord Stream 2 to one of your cronies, some banker thing, that brings you a profit in 6 months that you would have spent decades earning under normal circumstances. And Putin was really counting on the fact that the opportunity to make such deals with him would keep Trump from taking tough actions. But Putin overlooked one thing. He has lived in the dictatorship hole he created himself for far too long. And Putin failed to consider that Trump, even with his absolutely industrial era mannerisms and his authoritarian mindset, still has to listen to the American electorate, to his opponents, and to other political elites that exist in America. And no matter what he personally wants, he is forced from time to time to do things he doesn't like. Yes, he doesn't like Zelensky. Yes, he would prefer if he weren't around. Yes, he would like Ukraine, perhaps still under Zelensky's leadership, to have problems for a long time, because apparently Trump has some grievances against your president related to the fact that he wanted some compromising material on the family of the previous president. And most likely Zelensky, being a reasonable person, decided not to get involved in this in any way. And accordingly, I think that Trump is a vindictive person, and perhaps even petty in some ways, and he remembers this. But he still can't help but support Ukraine, including under Zelensky's leadership, because he tried to shake up the situation. He tried to portray that Zelensky supposedly lacks support, but the opposite happened. What happened was, once again, the consolidation of Ukrainian society, and basically they got exactly what they fought for. And that's why, therefore, Trump is forced to act with an eye on the electoral process. And that's why Trump is doing what he's doing now. Because if you look at the sociology curve, there is a very clear correlation between these. I almost said a word starting with B, this Trump-style fence-sitting regarding Ukraine and the decline in his ratings. In other words, American society doesn't like that kind of thing. It's used to America being the good cop. Well, maybe not always good, sometimes even tough, but fair. America has a huge magnum. All the bandits are jumping around on their hind legs in front of it, and everyone is very afraid of it. But here we have an obvious main global villain, worse than the Ayatollah, worse than that moon-faced, half-crazy Kim. And this villain isn't jumping around on his hind legs instead. He's dragging their president through the mud. And of course, Americans simply couldn't accept that. That's exactly why Trump first gave this 50-day ultimatum, then waited and saw there was no reaction from the public, no reaction from Russia. And the reaction from China was humiliating for him yet again. And once again, American society was like, wait a minute, now you're going to let the Chinese drag you through the mud too. So as a result, he was forced not to give Xi Jinping that pass as he had originally planned. So he phrased everything beautifully. And right during the moment when Putin was summoned to the Beijing Party Committee, the strict chairman of the Beijing Committee tells him, come on, Vladimir, you're wrong here. You really messed things up here. So let's get this sorted out. You need to do some work on your mistakes. Go back to Moscow and report and call in 3 days. But in the end, he didn't wait, because he understands that Xi Jinping will most likely do everything possible to keep this situation frozen for as long as possible. Because Xi Jinping is enjoying this since he's getting absolutely free oil and gas out of it. He has Trump dancing around him, constantly offering him something. Moreover, he even suggests, let me come to Beijing to see you. And then even had to deny it, saying, no, I never offered that at all. It's all them inviting me, and I still have to think about it. You see, everything in this politics is really becoming an open book today. These days, it's even a bit boring to work as a television commentator because, if before they did everything behind closed doors, kept everything secret, always tried to create confusion, furrow their brows, frown, puff out their cheeks. Now everything's pretty much out in the open. The world has become transparent. All their actions instantly reach the audience. And that's why the situation is clear. And it's also clear, in my opinion, that Putin will now reduce the intensity, shifting everything to a kind of war that will suit the American electorate so they don't get too upset about the number of terrorist attacks in Ukraine. Since we don't like it, it's against America's position. Accordingly, Putin will try to carry out fewer terrorist attacks In other words, he will try to keep their number low enough so that they don't reach Washington's attention. That's basically it. That's more or less what we're expecting. Will this solve Ukraine's problem? No, it won't. We need to keep thinking about how to get rid of all this rabble in the Kremlin, all these self-proclaimed ayatollahs of all Rus.
You know, Rostislav, I'd like to suggest we shift the direction of our conversation a bit now. So recently I decided to dig deeper into what's currently happening in the Caucasus, let's say Azerbaijan and Russia. And I came across an opinion that, in fact, this whole story of the standoff between Moscow and Baku is much more global than it seems. That Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, is not just someone who invites everyone to Ankara or Istanbul, but a person who has long dreamed of creating the so-called Union of Turkic Peoples. And not just to create it formally, but so that it becomes, let's say, a kind of alternative to NATO, specifically in the military sense.
At the very beginning of this process, I was present in Bashkortostan, saw the creation of the Great Turan with my own eyes.
That is probably...
They opened the Turkish Lyceum in every village in Bashkortostan, and this was a direct and immediate influence on the Russian Federation, specifically on its Turkic-speaking part. And so here, of course, the Turks are acting in a completely straightforward manner. This Turkish imperialism is coming out of them quite openly, and moreover, by the way, they were doing it skillfully as well. Look, they didn't start bombing Bashkortostan, for example, did they? Nor did they start saying that they were going to denazify the Russians, for instance, where, anti-Turks are supposedly in power, right? They did all of this through education. Just think about how smart that approach is. In other words, they simply allocated a lot of money to educate Russian Turks who have been oppressed by Moscow and forced into a completely colonial situation for a very long time. And in recent years, this has only intensified. So they entered there very carefully, and that's exactly why they found quite a few sympathizers. And they acted in exactly the same way in all other Turkic-speaking countries. And first and foremost, by the way, in Azerbaijan, because they don't consider Azerbaijan to be something separate from themselves at all. They believe that it's the same Turkey, just a slightly different version. Well, maybe I'm exaggerating a bit right now, of course. If I were a diplomat, I would have provoked an international scandal, but thankfully I'm not. And that's why I can speak to your audience as simply and clearly as possible. So yes, they are promoting their so-called Turkish world in a very gentle way. Yes, within his own country, Erdogan acts harshly. And my Turkish friends with whom I studied in Paris can't stand him because they're liberals just like me. But accordingly, yes. But at the same time, when it comes to expansion, it's done 100 times more intelligently than Putin's crazy attempts to force everyone to love Mother Russia, so to speak.
And what about this possible move by the United States? At least there have been rumors about leasing the Zangezur corridor for 100 years. What is this story even about? And in general, the Great Turan that we talked about, the Union of Turkic People show, will this relate to the Kremlin? Or are these parallel stories that don't intersect at all? Or will they intersect?
Thank God, Putin has completely lost this war. He will have absolutely nothing to do with the Turkic world, because I can tell you this with complete confidence. I have very close contacts, as I just mentioned, both in Turkey and in Azerbaijan, in the Caucasus. Well, what can I say? If I was the vice president of the Cooperation for the Development of the Caucasus, accordingly, I have contacts who still keep me informed about what's happening there. Listen, the Caucasus, goodbye. Azerbaijan, Armenia, goodbye. Georgia is still clinging to this scoundrel and bastard who has usurped power there, keeping it in the Russian orbit. But that's only a matter of time. He will be thrown out of there so thoroughly that not even a trace of him will remain in the modern history of Georgia, because it's a wonderful freedom-loving country, no less freedom-loving than Ukraine. And today it's under the yoke of these Kremlin scoundrels. This is, of course, a temporary situation, and it's the last outpost of Putin's influence. And Putin lost all these regions not only because he acts like a bull in a china shop, he also lost them because Russia is, in fact, a fascist state. Russia is a state of Nazis. Let me tell you this as someone with, well, how can I put this more delicately certain dark features, as Moscow police officers used to call me, right? So with my own experience, I can confidently tell you about this because Moscow was already racist and chauvinistic 20, 25 years ago. And today, when they have made this notorious Russian world their ideology, and when they have declared that Russians can be considered superior to non-Russians, when officially in the main anthem of this Russian imperialism, in that song by that blonde little fascist, they openly sing that if you are Russian, then you are lucky. And if you are not Russian, then you are not lucky. Can you imagine what kind of demons this unleashed from the underground of that Russian marginal nationalist chauvinist movement, which had been lurking there, clutching their knives for a quarter of a century? So today the state is so nationalistic that not only Azerbaijan and other Turkic-speaking countries surrounding the Russian Federation want nothing to do with it, but also those non-Russian people. And actually, it's not just the Turks who live within Russia itself, because they know that all these mosques, I almost said damn Moscows, they really do see us as second-class citizens. Well, it's true. And so, yes, maybe I've just said something here that YouTube might start raising some complaints about. But it's all true, comrade YouTube.
It really is. So, Rostislav, thank you very much. As you can see today, we've had quite an unconventional conversation. We started off in an original way, then discussed the agenda, and finished by broadening the geography in the sense that, well, Putin will lose more than one war.
All of this is very, very close to what I have done and experienced in my life. So forgive me for the emotions, but sometimes I feel like they need to be conveyed to the audience.
I think emotions, on the contrary, are exactly what makes it great. It's wonderful, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much, Rostislav, for being our guru.
Always happy to, Daniel. Take care.